Hello, y'all. So, what we're going to be doing today, since we had our issues last Wednesday, I tried, but unfortunately, there were some issues going on with the audio within the settings of Class Collaborate, and I knew I could figure it out eventually, but I figured, well, by the time I do get it figured out what's going on here, it'll be pretty much time for the class to be over with. I didn't want to feel like I was wasting y'all's time while I try to figure that out. But I did finally figure it out. But like I said, it did take me a little bit. But hopefully, if it happens again in the future and we do have to go to virtual learning in the future, we'll have a much better time of it. But I just was not expecting that. That sort of blindsided me Wednesday. But anyway, here we are. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pick up with where we would have been Wednesday with our discussion of William Blake. I have selected 5 of his poems from the text for us to look at in more depth and to talk about a little bit. Um, just going back to some things that we talked about on Monday, William Blake was one of those poets who was among that first generation of the Romantic poets. He lived from 1757 to 1827. He was 69 years old at the time that he passed away. For in those days, that was a pretty healthy, long life. It might be kind of young by today's standards, but for back then, that was a pretty full life. He was a painter and engraver as well as poet. He lived a quiet life, you know, as compared to his writings, which would have made it seem like someone who was living quite a tumultuous life. But his actual real life was quite settled and quiet. He was married to the same woman for most of his life. They were a childless couple, but by all reports, pretty happy together. The only thing they really fought over that we know of is they tended to fight about money a lot because, as you see here, the couple also lived in poverty most of their lives. And William Blake was partly to blame for that because he just would not hold a regular steady job. He was an artist and that's how he wanted to live his life, but unfortunately it's usually not a way to make a good living. So that was the only thing his wife was a little bit unhappy with him about. And some other things that we could probably get into, but we won't because it's a little bit beyond what you need to know for this course. Here's one image of what William Blake looked like. Most of his portraits are from his older years, of course. Here's a big question that gets raised about William Blake, because some people argue that he was a prophet. Certainly, he presented himself that way. From the time that he was a child, this was when this really started, right? When he was a small child. He would tell his parents that he could talk to angels, that angels spoke to him, and he often got beat for that. Uh, People didn't believe him, they thought he was crazy. Some people called him a mad genius. His poetry seems to bear that out. Or was he just plain crazy? You decide. Well, now I was being a little bit facetious there. I'm joking a little bit, right? Because definitely William Blake was not someone who was just crazy. Did he have some mental issues? Probably. But he did write, some of the most brilliant poetry of the English language. There's no denying that. And there's no denying um, how influential his work has been, even though it wasn't well received in his own time. It's one of those cases where over time his work has been reevaluated and kind of put into its proper place. He's generally recognized today as certainly one of our most original and innovative and genius poets. And based on a lot of what he wrote, that question of whether he was a prophet or not, did he really have that ability? I'm going to go out on a limb here because I would argue, I think William Blake definitely had a gift of some sort. He had a gift of vision. I mean, the poems didn't come from out of thin air. You know, William Blake took this stance that he was sort of just channeling. When he would write his poems, he was channeling what he was being told by these messengers. So make of that what you will, but I think it's very, very interesting. So Blake's major work that we're going to be concerned with was a collection of poems that he wrote, and he kept adding to this collection throughout his life. But it was a collection called The Songs of Innocence and of Experience. Now, initially, he just put together the first collection, which was the Songs of Innocence. Then later, he amassed a collection of poems that he called his Songs of Experience, and eventually he just put both of those together. But all of the poems that you've been assigned for today, these are all from this collection. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what was the theme of this collection and how is that theme reflected in the poems that we have for today. Blake was obsessed with something that he called the contrary states of the soul. He believed that there were two realms in which we exist spiritually. So the one that we start with, of course, is innocence, which he believed. Let me back up just a little bit, because William Blake had this whole complicated mythology that he created and invented, and it's much more complicated than we would have the scope or breadth or time to even scrape the tip of the iceberg of in this course. But he believed that all souls are descended from the land of Har, and it's the state that we exist in before birth. It's the state of purity. And of course, much of babyhood and early childhood is spent in this state, according to Blake. Now, he argued that the transformation to experience begins from the moment we emerge from the womb, from the moment that we're actually born. We're born into the state of experience, which is going to corrupt us. But he would argue that the time in which we are babies, when we're infants, very early childhood, when we're like little toddlers, he would say, this is the time of life that we are at least closest to that sort of pure Edenic state. Now, over time, we enter the realm of experience. Experience is life, essentially, adulthood. It's coming into awareness, it's corruption. It's what the Bible calls sin, because it's what we get introduced to. But Blake didn't look at experience as just committing acts of sin. He just believed it's that time of our lives where we come into this sense of awareness of ourselves. And corruption is brought about by several factors. Again, that romantic view, urbanization. As soon as we're aware of our environment, we're corrupted. Adults corrupt us when we're children. And all the experiences that we have on that road to adulthood. Pain, suffering, and of course, eventually death. That's part of experience. Now, this goes back to, if you think about, in Genesis in the Bible, when God created Adam and Eve, and they lived in the state of bliss in Eden until they become aware of sin, and then they're cast out of Eden, and that's the introduction to original sin. And from that point forward, they must work, they must toil. Eve in pain must bear children. And that's exactly what William Blake is talking about here. It's that transition from innocence to experience. So, apologies here for the slide. Looks like I tried to cram too much text on there, but Blake argues that both states are necessary for spiritual health and growth. So he's not arguing that one is better than the other. He's not arguing that it's better to live in that state of innocence than to have experience. In fact, Blake said both are necessary. And he was actually very much against the idea of trying to maintain or trying to prolong innocence, because he said that's not where the soul is meant to be. If you're innocent, you're also ignorant. There's an old saying, ignorance is bliss. But Blake said, as long as we exist in that state of innocence, we also exist in the state of ignorance, which is not spiritually healthy. Suffering, in other words, part of his arguing is that suffering is a necessity. We have to go through those experiences. And so just as we must be both flesh and spirit in order to be whole as human beings, we must therefore be both innocent and experienced. And again, you will see for sure that the poems reflect that. Now, there's a third tier that Blake talks about, which is tested innocence. The ideal state that the spirit returns to once it has survived experience. But we're not going to spend a lot of time with that third tier. It was something that Blake was aware of, but according to his theology, he said only a select few souls ever obtain this elusive tier. And the ones that do are generally the ones that are considered saints and martyrs. So Jesus Christ, for example, Blake would say Jesus was an example of someone who achieved that third tier of tested innocence. In other words, now it is circular in the sense that we are born in innocence, but then we quickly embark on experience. But if we survive experience, and here's the key, if we